I think I've always been interested in cemeteries. I grew up overseas in India, Pakistan, Iran, and there were times during my childhood when my parents would stop in cemeteries. I want to say mostly in India, because the British, having colonized India, brought their cemetery traditions. So there'd be the white marble obelisks, the kinds of tombstones you'd see in England, and we would stop and occasionally visit graveyards. But probably prior to that would be that I would spend summers with my grandparents in southern Illinois, a town called West Salem, which is founded by Germans. And my grandfather, a Moravian, was the groundskeeper and bookkeeper for the Moravian church's cemetery. And so when I was 10, maybe 10, 11, somewhere in there, I remember him taking me to the cemetery and walking around and telling me stories. He probably did it more than once. I just remember that he would point to a stone and he would tell me what he knew about the person buried there. And what he knew was what he had done by asking people, doing a little research. He had been given the ledgers from the previous groundskeeper, and so these ledgers would give a cause of death. And he had let me look at them. So when I started reading tombstones, and it may have been younger than age 10 or 11, I really don't remember, one of those summers, probably bored, I went to the cemetery on my bike and I started reading, and I discovered the epitaphs, I discovered the poetry. And I started writing down people's names and dates, and then I would come back to Grandpa's office and take out the ledger and see how they died. And I remember it was pretty much always disappointing, because the stone might hint at something and then the ledger would tell me the truth, and it wouldn't be nearly as good as what I was hoping for. My favorite example was there was an epitaph that said, "The voice at midnight came, he started up to hear. A mortal arrow pierced his frame, he fell but felt no fear." I thought, this man has been killed by Indians. What he died of was something like dysentery. I mean, a bowel thing, a disease. It was very ordinary, and yet he had been given an epitaph that was very extraordinary. And I thought, well, this is great. You know, that you can read something on a stone and then go look them up. So even though that did not pan out, I still went on and I read other stones, and I continued to look up people, especially when it was children. I think maybe that's when you're a child and you're looking on a child's tombstone. My grandfather had told me family stories because his mother was buried in that cemetery when he was 13 years old, and he described her funeral to me. The Moravians buried in sections, where the men were buried in one section, the adult women in another, the children in another. His mother died when the women's section was full. The women's section filled up first, probably because of deaths in childbirth, and so she was buried outside the fence and in the dead of winter. And so he described how he felt as a 13-year-old boy seeing his mother buried away from the other women. Now eventually, of course, they enlarged the section and they moved the fence, but he saw her grave by itself at the edge of the women's section. And so I think that must have planted this love of the stories in graveyards, the stories on the stones, the stories of when you interview older people, the fact that there were lambs on those stones, that there were symbols on the stones, carvings, motifs that had meaning. I don't know when I started learning that the fact that clasping hands or a pointing finger meant something on a tombstone, but that you could look at the stones and see them and draw conclusions. I think I started that at a very early age.